want to tell you a story about something that's at the heart of our identity. This is a story about cultural heritage, which is the physical markers of our culture. It's monuments, sites, shipwrecks, dances, songs, paintings, and even stamp collections. In 75 years, I believe we will have destroyed our cultural heritage, or at least allowed it to disappear. We will have lost touch with our shared humanity because it was embodied in our heritage. The clash of civilizations will have moved on to the battlefield. Things like the destruction of ancient Palmyra in Syria, a World Heritage Site, or the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan for shock value will become so routine we will not be shocked anymore. But I also believe the path we're following is not inevitable or unavoidable. Now, there are two drivers I see leading us towards the doom of cultural heritage. First is our suffocating hoarding instincts, and the other one is using heritage to promote divisive groupings and mega gang mentality. First, on our hoarding instincts, let me give you an example. I have a really hard time letting go of certain things, particularly books. I love my books, even though I know I will never reread most of them. Now, hoarding revolves around an anxiety, and the comfort of having a certain object and the memories it evokes close to us creates an inability to let go. We sort of do the same thing with our cultural heritage as an anxiety of civilization. Now we keep collecting and amassing it. A new building is added to a heritage list, or a form of performance becomes protected, but we never stop to think why we wanted those things to be declared heritage to begin with, at least not after they have been legally protected. The status of heritage is nearly immutable, and the law guarantees that. In my research at UNSW Law, examining the impacts of heritage law across the world, I'm constantly thinking about what it means to become cultural heritage forever. Now, in the same way we're surrounded by heritage, I'm surrounded by books at home. Sure, they make me feel good, they evoke some memories, but I'm running out of space. So I need to do one of three things. First, I can let go of at least some of these books to make room for new ideas, and in doing so, I force myself to make choices about what books are worth saving over and over again, even if I have already decided to save these books before. Two, I can simply stop buying books and become very sad in my ways of thinking because I won't be exposed to many new ideas. Or three, I can let myself be absorbed by a labyrinth of paper, which will one day probably catch fire. Now, does it sound bleak and a bit extreme? Sure, but bear with me, because something like that happens to heritage. The World Heritage List has 1,121 sites on it. 1,121. It was designed to host a few things that would remind us of our shared humanity, and now it's impossible to keep up with it. 1,121. And that's just one of the lists before we even get to the many museums out there and their preposterous inventories. Now, did you know that what's on display in a major museum is usually only about 10% of their collection? We're surrounding ourselves with stuff, and that's problematic for two related reasons. First, we need to make sense of that heritage. And as a result, we need to rely more and more on experts to tell us what to do with our own culture. Because of that, as well-meaning as those experts are, they tend to forget that they work for us, and they start working for the heritage. Now, it's a good thing for the heritage to be worked on in some contexts, because it prevents heritage from being subject to the fickle politics of the day, like what happens when people say that they want to shrink the size of the Tasmanian Wilderness Area, which is also on the World Heritage List, to allow for more logging. But it also means that I stop being asked to make decisions about the books I care about, which forces me to think about who I am and my values, and I defer to a librarian instead, who's an even worse hoarder than I am and has a professional interest in me having more and more books. So having too much heritage actually makes us less connected to it because we can't keep track of all that heritage. To be sure, we each feel differently about different elements of our culture, but pushing that representativeness too far only pulls us apart. And the second reason is that with too much heritage and us being disconnected from it because we can't make sense of the sheer volume, it's easy for someone else to use it to shape our minds in dangerous ways. Heritage can then be used not to show us how we're all alike, but how we're all different. And to then go on to say that we need to like different people less is one terrifying little step. And this brings me to the second driver leading to the doom of cultural heritage: using heritage to promote divisive groupings and mega gang mentality. Heritage can be and has been used in dangerous ways to create division. During a very long period of time in Rwanda, for instance, heritage in that country was used to create a division between two groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis. The heritage was interpreted to say that Hutus were considered farmers and the Tutsis herders. Tutsis had more money and were therefore from a more distinguished ethnic group and should be in charge. Now, Rwandans from both groups were told by experts on the basis of the archaeological record that they were fundamentally different and that one group, who just so happened to be in power, was more civilized than the other, and the other group was primitive. And then, 26 years ago, things blew up, and 800,000 people were killed in the space of a month. Manipulating and selecting heritage helped make that happen. Now, there seems to be a contradiction here, I know. I'm saying we need to be selective about what heritage we keep, but that we also need to make room to learn about other cultures. So what gives? What happens is that when we keep selecting and culling down, we make room for things that will broaden our horizons. So instead of only choosing heritage that says something about Western civilization, we take a good look at heritage that shows, for instance, how in Japan they have also built temples, but they were much less concerned with those temples being made of stone that would last forever, and more concerned with making sure that these temples were used and kept alive by people coming to worship. Now, we're all human, and we share our humanity. And selecting, by the way, is absolutely normal. If we did not select, we would still all be reading only ancient Greek or ancient Chinese or ancient Hindu texts in school, because there would be so much of it, and we would not have time to read anything else. And we would lose tremendously by doing that. Now, thinking about the future, I believe we have two choices. The first choice, which is the path of last resistance, is to keep doing exactly what we're doing with our culture, which is either nothing or protecting the culture so tightly that it becomes rigid and divorced from our everyday lives. We become like the shepherds in the Swiss Alps, which is also on the World Heritage List, who were told that they needed to stop herding because it would harm the heritage. And now the Swiss government has to helicopter lawnmowers onto the Alps to cut the grass. Now, heritage law separated heritage from people. And if we're less connected to our heritage, people have an opening to manipulate it so that when it suits them, we can concoct enemies that are less civilized or even less human. And we then go to war, we spill a lot of blood, and it all becomes Mad Max. Or, here's the second, the dangerous option. We learn to let go of culture so we can make room for culture. Now, does that sound like Marie Kondo? A little bit. But the process of figuring out whether something brings us joy forces us to remember why we selected something to begin with. And it has an effect in our future by forcing us to look at the past. 75 years ago, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, had just been created and was trying to work out what to do with culture and cultural heritage. The Constitution of UNESCO declared two important things. First, that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. And two, that ignorance of each other's ways and lives has been a common cause throughout the history of mankind of that suspicion and mistrust between the peoples of the world, for which their differences have all too often broken into war. We already knew that culture was important 75 years ago, but we assumed that more culture meant better culture. We're getting overwhelmed by the amount of it, and that's being counterproductive. Now we need to allow the World Heritage List to be trimmed down, and one way is to ask states and communities to reconsider every now and then whether they still care enough about that heritage and whether that heritage still tells an important story about the humanity we want to be. And if we're serious about those two ideas in the UNESCO Constitution, we need to rethink our relationship with culture. We need to let go. We need to ask ourselves why we care. We need to ask ourselves what the culture we treasure does for one another. Or we can go to the Thunderdome. But my message is, we're at the halfway point. 75 years in the past, we made a choice. And the way we have followed it through has brought us to now. Hoarding, bombing of heritage for ideological shock value, manipulation of identity to incite genocide. Now, looking 75 years into the future, we can keep pursuing this path, or we get a do-over. And I would rather do that before I end up buried under a messy pile of my own books next to a candle. Thank you.